Turkey's military mission to secure its border with Syria is underway. In this special programme, we're examining Ankara's Operation Olive Branch against the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group. We will discuss why Turkey is taking action now and what the reaction is around the world. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Now, this air and ground operation aims to remove the US-backed YPG from the north of Syria. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's promised to end the mission swiftly, but could the move shift the dynamics of the war in Syria, and how will the international players react? Turkey's tanks gather at the Syrian border. On January the 20th, Ankara launched Operation Olive Branch. Its aim, it says, to clear Syria's Afrin region of YPG and PKK terrorists, numbering in the tens of thousands. YPG terrorists affiliated with the PKK and armed by the United States have been fighting Daesh and Syrian forces. The air and ground offensive began days after Washington announced plans to continue providing military support for the YPG in Syria. Turkish forces, with the help of the Free Syrian Army, are working to force them out. But international reaction to the mission has been mixed. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the operation will not be protracted.
İnşallah çok kısa sürede bu operasyonu.
The US Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, cited Turkey's NATO membership and the country's, quote, legitimate security concerns. While Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, used the operation to highlight what Russia sees as the United States', quote, destructive role in global affairs. In Iran, a government spokesman said the country is following the developments and called for an end to the operation. And the British Foreign Office said that it recognised that Turkey has what it called, quote, legitimate interest in the security of its borders. Operation Olive Branch could shift the dynamics of the war in Syria. But until the YPG relinquish their control over the Syria-Turkey border, Ankara will continue to defend its border and Turkey's security concerns. Pleased to say that joining us via Skype from Ankara, the political analyst Onur Erim. Here at the round table, we have Yossi Meckelberger, Research Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Sami Hamdi is here too, Editor-in-Chief of International Interest and Online Current Affairs Analysis Magazine, and Robert Fox, Defence Correspondent for the Evening Standard. Thank you very much for coming in at what I know is pretty short notice. Maybe you can all give your opinion on this, but I'm going to start with you, Sami. What do you think is really going on here?
I think Turkey has no choice in terms of getting involved in northern Syria. I think a strong YPG, a strong autonomous Kurdish region in northern Syria is disastrous for Turkey because it encourages the Kurdish population in their own domestic situation, their own domestic scenario. And Erdogan relies on about more than 10% of the Kurdish vote to ensure a majority in Turkey. I also think that it's very interesting that the Russians have said that they won't intervene, almost as if they see a very good interest for them in this conflict. Because I think what is really happening here is the US needs some sort of leverage in Syria against the Russians and the Iranians. It feels like Syria is going out of its hands. It has no force to back and it has no reason to stay in Syria after the fall of ISIS. However, if the US can have a strong Kurdish group that is loyal towards more US interests with regards to Syria, it can stand up to Russia and to Iran, which has its own militias and is backing the Syrian regime in Syria. For Turkey itself, I think it's an existential crisis, because I think that if the Kurds succeed in northern Syria, if the Kurds defeat Turkey or succeed in establishing themselves in northern Syria, I think Turkey will be well on the route for a split. Because if the Kurdish start acting up in Turkey, and I say acting up in a negative way, which I probably shouldn't, but if they start acting up in Turkey, they will be backed by all the human rights organizations, by the US, by France, by Europe, which will be desperately seeking to undermine Erdogan and the AKP, who have been a thorn in the side of US policy and Western foreign policy in the Middle East in recent times.
What's the US's game here? Well, it hasn't done anything in this particular case, but has it missed something?
It's a very bad one in half a sentence. Terrible miscalculation, and I agree with Sami. I think this is how it all started, this particular turn, this particular twist of fortune. Because when we got it, and it was not even a proper policy announcement or inspired policy leak through the usual suspects like the New York Times or whatever, it was an email which sort of suggested, well, on the whole, we should really start standing up a force of between 25,000 and 30,000 Kurdish fighters based on the YPG, because the YPG is particularly good, and they do remember the YPG and allied elements.
Good, you mean militarily?
Militarily,
yeah.
Fighting in Kobani, because frankly, most of the rest of the Kurdish forces have been disappointing, including the much vaunted Peshmerga. It's typical default American thinking. Let's get somebody else to do it. Let's get a proxy. Let's try and stand up. The Afghan National Army being an absolute disaster in Afghanistan. But they didn't think it through. They didn't consult Turkey. And I think, I won't go rabbiting on into great detail there, but that was the go date for Erdogan to say, yes, we will do this operation, because exactly as we just heard extremely articulately, is that Turkey feels it cannot afford to have Kurdish enclaves in these very, very strategic positions on the Turkish-Syria border.
In Ankara, do you agree with this assessment? I mean, is Turkey pretty frightened before all of this?
Yes, and President Erdogan has made this very clear, has been making this very clear from the beginning. Turkey said our red line, President Erdogan said over and over, our red line is to make sure that our borders are secure. You have to realize these are towns with YPG elements that are literally within a sound reach of the Turkish towns near the border. We have just seen the news are saying that the Turkey just opened up a new front in the Afrin operation to the town of Aziz. And this is going to go on for along the border, I believe, for as long as the forces in the region that are dominating are going to make sure Turkish-Syrian border, hence the cities and towns near the border, are completely secure.
See, one of the assessments I read this morning, slightly tangential to this, Yossi, is that Syria may well be tackling what it sees as a real problem, but in doing so, it is saying once the conflict in Syria is finished, we want you, Russia and the US in particular, to understand that we won't be messed with.
But that's exactly, it represents ongoing tragedies in the Middle East. Why the collapse of the state system? The idea that the conflict is going to an end, when it's going to an end, and when it ends, and if it ends, is Syria still Syria, as we knew it 7 years ago? It might completely disintegrate to certain enclaves of this and the other. The other tragedy is not resolving any other issues like the Kurdish issue. So they keep reappearing because no issue in the Middle East is resolved. So Syria won't probably be the same Syria as we knew it in 2011. Then there are so many fingers in this pie. Everyone is involved, whether it's Iran, it's Russia, it's the United States, Israel a little bit, and then Turkey. And everyone is trying to ensure their own interests. So obviously Turkey has an interest whenever there is a Kurdish minority. But the longer term issue is how Turkey deals with the Kurdish issue, as Iraq needs to deal with that. Well, none of them is actually addressed. And what we see is trying to give a short-term answers to what is actually long-term strategic.
I'll come to you guys in just a minute, but let me go back to Ona to talk about that particular point. What is the sort of Syria that Turkey would like to see when the conflict is over, given the Kurdish population in northern Syria? What does it need to see to make it feel safe?
As of now, I think there was reports this morning that a couple of Turkish towns, especially in Kilis, there was some shell attacks by the YPG to its town. Right now, let's clear everything off the table. Obviously, the U.S. has some concerns in the region. So does Russia. So does Iran, and maybe China, and some other countries that are in the region or out of the region. Right now, what we have to realize, or maybe what President Trump should, how President Trump should be addressed, Turkey's position is very clear. Assume Kilis, assume Gaziantep as San Antonio, Texas, and assume Afrin or Aziz or any other cities in the region that are close to the border as any of the towns in Mexico near the U.S. border. Turkey has no other concern right now in the region before its border is absolutely secured. One of the things that's going to come up, I believe, is that Turkey is taking this action and it's seeing only one force in front of him, which is the armed branch of the PKK in Syria, YPG, PYD. We also have to realize this YPG is very openly, as very openly announced by the U.S., is trained, armed, educated, and situated by the U.S. So at one point, and this is exactly why I think the U.S. has been issuing very contradictory comments about the issue, is going to come to a position between U.S. and Turkey. Turkey had some other problems and some other concerns in the region, especially with Assad in the past. But Turkey has put all this aside right now, and it's only concerned about its own security.
Okay, can I jump in there and bring this back to the table about the United States and Turkey, both members of NATO, and there are US special forces in this part of northern Syria.
Right.
A little bit away from Afrin itself, but there is the potential for danger of
it's a big headline. And I think, and I absolutely follow on what Yossi says, we're thinking of this almost two-dimensionally. It's old politics. It's the nation state, you're absolutely right. And let's mention it now, it'll come up on the table, the borders of Sykes-Picot, et cetera, et cetera. We're quite clearly in a new dimension of history. The fluidity of the borders, we heard from our colleague from Turkey. We're going somewhere new. And what we're seeing is Turkey leaving the NATO-US sphere, cozying up to Russia. Not only this, a huge shock, really, to the deep state in America, Turkey buying Russian air defense systems. That's a really big development, because are they going to trade NATO codes? Because a lot of those air defense systems are predicated on breaking through US-dominated air defenses, and there are bottom lines in old-fashioned money, to go back, which I've just denounced. But you see, one of the interests of Russia, which is absolutely clear, which they've got the airport and they've got the seaport on the Mediterranean in Syria, and by golly, thick and thin, whether Mr. Assad is there in Damascus or not, they're going to stick with it. And these are absolutely fundamentals which we're not going to get out of, and you are absolutely right in your question in saying that these things are now irreconcilable. Back to Yossi, back to Sami again. This is not just going to be a 3-day operation. This will now, whether the fighting stops or not, it will spin out for a very long time.
And as you know, but this is always the danger. This is always danger. You start with 2-3 days operation, you find yourself 2-3 years down the line, still bogged down in a guerrilla warfare that is almost impossible to win.
Well, we'll talk about the military side of it in just a moment, if we may. But you wanted to come talk.
No, I was going to mention. I think that Turkey's intervention exposes a very interesting, with regards to the dynamics of what's going on, because the Kurds don't truly trust the U.S. either. The Kurds, the reason they're moving so quickly is because they don't want a repeat of Iraq, whereby when crunch time comes and they want independence, the U.S. says, "Oh, we're not getting involved." When Abadi's forces in Iraq were marching on Kurdistan and they expected the U.S.
of 1924, it's a story of betrayal. Absolutely
right. After years of U.S. support, telling them we're going to help you with independence, doomsday came, crunch time came, and the U.S. abandoned the Kurds. The YPG are are saying, okay, it's good that we have US support right now, but we need to move quickly and efficiently and create a situation whereby we will not need the US to back us on the day where we declare our independence. And with regards to the US, their issue is this. They know that the Kurds have this sort of reservations, but the US has no other force it can viably back. It desperately wants a stakehold in Syria. It's losing to Russians and losing to the Iranians. And Turkey is feeling that the US cannot be trusted, because let's remember what happened in Kobani before. Erdogan has reason to distrust the US. When ISIS attacked Kobani, Erdogan expected some sort of US assistance to help the Kurds fight them. Instead, the US thought, this is great. If Erdogan gets involved, ISIS attacked Turkey, Erdogan is damaged domestically. If he doesn't move, he loses the Kurdish vote and he loses his majority. This is brilliant, let's stay and watch. It took a very shrewd political move from Erdogan to play on Kurdish divisions and invite the Peshmerga to cross the border, and the US went, ah, damn it.
Yeah. Rather than the regional implications, what about the military ones? I mean, he said it's not going to be protracted. I mean, we've talked about whether these things can drag on forever and ever anyway, but militarily, is it going to be a little bit like the US against Mexico?
I don't think the Kurds are that naive to think that they can really rely on the United States for long-term backing and a long-term campaign. They need to rely on themselves.
You could see, and there is some really good tactical thinking going on. As we heard, there was a bit of counter-firing across the border.
They capture two villages,
and then they pull back, and then they disperse, and then they move around. Absolutely right. They're not relying on sort of great American brains sorting this one out. They're fighting for their own again.
And that's their advantage.
Of the mountains, you
and
know,
there's their advantage.
Yeah.
They know the terrain better than any American knows the terrain. They're fighting for their own interest and not for another force interest. And they will fight for their own villages.
But do you think, from Turkey's point of view, they're perhaps underestimating the resistance that they're going to meet?
Turkey has had a very difficult time over the years. As our colleagues, I would say, with the PKK, this has been a grinding. It hasn't been the British in Northern Ireland. It's been much nastier and very, very difficult indeed, and very intertwined. I mean, the President Erdogan gave a bit of a clue of it. He said, oh, yes, we do have natural kindred there in Turkmen and these tiny pockets of tiny tribal groups. You know, that only through this did we wake up and discover there were people over in Sinjar called Yazidis and so on. This is extremely complex mosaic countries. But what we're getting also is that we're getting from Damascus, and we have to do the two I's, Idlib and Erbil, is that Assad is absolutely determined, as Yossi was saying, to get a unitary state back. And this is all part of that melange. And of course, if there is going to be a Kurdish entity, and it has been pretty successful, way over in the east, what we've had based on Erbil. And again, there is a lot of Western sympathy, more than sympathy, and practical support, because there is an intelligentsia that they can deliver. So that's why I fear, in the medium term, Turkey is going to lose out on the public opinion or the international opinion war.
Sammy, can I come to you?
Yeah, of course.
I'd like to come to you just a minute, but go to Ona over there. Is there an assessment in Turkey that this could be the end of Turkey-US relations, the status quo within NATO, that sort of perhaps going into an area where US forces, special forces are operating, could create a problem that is bigger than something that we've seen so far? That Turkey's taking a very, very bold step and saying something about its future.
I think day-to-day politics may reveal that right now, but I believe deep inside the Turkish government, and probably in the US too, both sides are very aware and very well know that in the long run, neither side can afford to lose each other as an ally, as a partner. Day-to-day politics, this may change, but I don't think in the medium or the long run, everybody expects and actually relies on probably that the partnership will continue in some level.
Sammy, you wanted to jump in, and then we'll get into the sort of best case, worst case scenarios as this plays out.
I was going to say, because you know, there was references made as well about short-term, long-term solution, what Turkey is thinking. I think even though the act looks short-termism in the way that Turkey has gone in, we should really look at it in the bigger picture, in that this is a last resort. Because Erdogan, since the AK Party came to power, they've tried a reconciliation with the Kurdish population, giving back the language and allowing them to speak and giving them all the freedoms that they were denied under the Ataturk legacy. In 2013, when they did the preemptive peace agreement, I say preemptive because Erdogan didn't need to do it. And I wrote at the time, and I said Erdogan should not do it because the geopolitical scene is not right for it. At that time, the Kurds had no choice. There was no view for independence at the time. So Abdullah Öcalan, who was in prison, said, we're happy for this peace process. When Syria descended into chaos and independence reared its head again, the peace process disintegrated. And now it's seeming as if Erdogan is getting his revenge on the Kurds. But what's happening here is that, my argument is that Erdogan has no choice anymore. The Kurds are a very real problem that will threaten to bring not him down, but split Turkey apart and ruin the AK party. Because a Kurdish independence in Syria means Kurdish independence in Turkey. And if you have a successful Kurdish state in Syria, then and a porous border where weapons can go through.
It's a massive border too, isn't it?
And Turkey knows that when that day comes, the US will not come to its aid, France will not come to its aid, Germany will not come to its aid, Iran won't, Russia won't, Saudi won't, UAE won't. It will be left all alone and everybody will watch, just as they did in Kobani.
Best case, worst case scenarios from Turkey's point of view, Yossi.
Yeah, but the question whether there is a military solution to this, and history tells us there are no military solution to this kind of situation. No, it doesn't mean that the political solutions are that easy, because they are difficult, but military force never achieve. The best case scenario is that Turkey...
This is from Turkey's point of view.
From Turkey's point of view, the best case scenario, it's a limited operation which it demonstrates its seriousness and its interest and withdraw back to its own border, but secure its border, and says, all right, in the long term, if there is any threat to the border, we are ready to come back. The worst case
not have an occupied 18, 20K buffer zone.
This is always dangerous. You're creating security zones, and usually with ongoing guerrilla warfare, and then the local forces...
go in, show you're serious, and then
show you're serious, and you come out, and minimize violation of human rights, because this won't play with the international community. Right. The worst case scenario is creating this security zone, going with full force ahead, creating human rights atrocities there, and then bogged down for the next God knows how long inside this security zone.
Well,
I couldn't disagree with almost with any of that at all. In the short term, absolutely right. There's a word for it: a strategic raid. Get in, get out, and pull back, and don't play around with cordons sanitaires, security zones, buffer zones, as you've described it. I doubt if it's going to happen that way, because, as we've said, the history between Turkey and Kurdish militant movements has not been that. The other problem, though, is that as this goes on, buffer zones, security zones, development zones on 3 borders, this northern one with Lebanon, which is very fragile now owing to refugees, which we haven't talked enough about, and Jordan, is going to be very, very difficult indeed. But drawing breath, there's an enormous strategic big picture here. America is pulling back. I won't say, you know, the rise and fall of big empires, because more and more it is going to be preoccupied by the military superiority, the growing overhang on American and NATO capability in specific areas and very dangerous areas of warfare by Russia and China, and that is cyber capability. And the thing that everybody is talking about, where is the massive, we haven't seen one yet, we've seen lots of different things, cyber attack going to come from. And that's why you see, I look at them in Afghanistan, I look at the US policy in the Middle East, as you say, you realize they're only concentrating on it at the moment, it seems to be, collectively with half a brain.
So, Sammy, what do you think the reaction of the populace in that area is going to be?
Bring us peace.
I think there's a lot of war fatigue.
Yeah.
But I think everybody just wants the war to finish. However, the problem is that they distrust each party that's involved, whether it's the US, whether it's the Russians, whether it's Assad, whether it's Turkey, whether it's the Kurds. So I think with regards to the local population, it's just, can we find an end to this particular war? I think just touching on the point about, you know, what's the best case scenario, I think with regards to Turkey, Turkey wants some honesty from the US. Turkey wants the US to say, look, we will pursue a policy in the Middle East that doesn't compromise your interests. But my other point is that I don't think the US relations with minority groups in the area will recover in the short term after its betrayal of the Kurds in Iraq. I think every group that starts to deal with the US again will deal with them on a very materialistic basis, but everybody now will be a cautious eye, because the US reputation has now become like the Russians in the 60s or 70s, where you ally with them and then crunch time comes, they abandon you, like they did with Abdel Nasser and some of these other presidents. So I think the US foreign policy, Bob put it as pulling back, I call it as it's become so incredibly messed, so incredibly messy, so incredibly incoherent. Nobody really knows whether they're a trusted ally anymore. And I think US and Russia and Iran have now become, whereas the US were here and Russia and Iran were here, now they're all on the same level. Yeah. Let's have a pocket with everybody and see who wins.
Involved there. You see, that this kind of operation, if they roll on. And you know, when it doesn't succeed, if it succeeds military, it's one thing. If it starts to fail, the generals will demand more force and more force. The politicians are already invested in an operation and they can't afford to lose. And then you get into this vicious cycle. So I think the next 2-3 days, maybe a week, will be really crucial to see where it's all going on. And look what happens in the international community. How forceful is the reaction from the international community? Okay. Or they're kind of winking and say, yes, we don't like it, but we let it happen.
Okay, what do you imagine is going to happen in the next 7 days?
Well, hopefully this whole thing come to an end. As the other commentators said, this will go in and go out and establish what we went in there for. The worst thing would be this thing to drag on for longer than it should. Turkey's right now, the goal is very clear, to secure its border, and hopefully this will happen much sooner than expected, hopefully, because if it goes on, it will bring on more problems as it drags along.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the three experts we've had here in the studio. We've been watching a special edition of Roundtable on the events of Operation Olive Branch. 24 hours a day you can get the most up-to-date news on TRT World of what is happening in that part of the world. From me and the Roundtable team, goodbye for now. Hope to see you next time.